What's up, everybody? Kier Gomes here, and welcome back. In today's episode, we are going to be tackling a subject that I have been wanting to talk about for quite some time, but I couldn't really find the right time to do it until 2 weeks ago when I did my Q&A video, and I received a question that I actually wanted to make an entire video about. And that is how I would rank all of the Orbit decks by Orbit Brown and Daniel Schneider from my least favorite all the way to my favorite. Or is it least favorite all the way to favorite? Least favorite to favorite, or whatever, you guys know what I mean. So today we are going to be talking about all of the Orbit decks, and we're going to rank them all the way in order from my least favorite to my very favorite. Now, for videos like this, I do like to stress the importance that this is my opinion, and this is going to be my ranking in order of just the attraction that I have to the deck, or the nostalgia, or just whatever makes me like the deck. I'm not going to be factoring in things like how rare they are. Since I have them all, I'm really just going to be ranking them on how they look, how they handle, how often I use them, and just what I like about them in general. Before we get started, please do drop a like on this video and subscribe if you haven't already. And without further ado, let's roll that intro and get you guys on your way.
Let's go.
Okay, so this was kind of a tricky list to make. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be starting from my least favorite Orbit deck, and we're going to go all the way up to my very favorite Orbit deck. The reason this was difficult is because I do love them all, and as most of you know, I'm a huge avid fan of the Orbit decks, and I do have a special connection to a lot of them, so it was not easy to do. I'm also not going to be including the Forest deck in this lineup. However, we will talk a little bit about it as an honorable mention just because it is technically affiliated with the Orbit brand. So here we go. Let's start with my least favorite. Okay, coming in at number 9, we have the Orbit First Edition playing cards. These are the original First Edition, not the reprints. Now, when I say that I love all of the Orbit decks, I really mean it. And this is a special case because if you've seen the Orbit documentary, you know everything that went into making this deck a reality, and you know how hard Chris Brown worked to make it happen. Just because this is number 9 does not mean that I don't love this deck, because I do. In a lot of ways, this deck is probably special to a lot of you because it's one of the more rare ones. It's one that not a lot of people have. Now, the reason that this deck is coming in so low on the list is just because this is a deck that I don't find myself picking up and using very often. I do like thicker borders, but I think that this deck brought them in a little bit too thick for my personal taste, which I know is just a sign of the times. But also the handling of this deck doesn't keep up with certain standards that the USPCC is able to producing now, especially when it comes to later versions of the Orbit deck. It's also the only deck that doesn't have an Ace of Spades designed by Daniel Schneider. However, it does have the classic Daniel Schneider Orbit Jokers, which I really do like, and which we can see on later versions of the deck. All right, so that is number 9. That is the First Edition Orbit deck. I'm not saying anything about it other than it just is what I like the least out of all of the decks, you know? So I wouldn't have it if I didn't love it, and I do love it, but I love it less than I love some of the other ones. So there you go. All right, and coming in the number 8 spot, we have the Orbit 3rd Edition. All right, now you guys are probably aware that this is the first Orbit deck designed by Daniel Schneider. Daniel Schneider is my favorite designer in the playing card world as of right now, but I'm not the world's biggest fan of purple. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't, and this is one of those decks that I genuinely think was a masterpiece. However, if this deck would have came in like a black color or a darker tone, I think I would have liked it even more. Some of the things that I do really like about this deck is it is the first deck that Daniel has designed for Orbit, which I mentioned, which also means that in terms of the Orbit series up to this point, the first 2 decks were pretty much the same design, just different colors, and this was a completely different take on the Orbit brand. I do love the incorporation of the astronauts. I love the Arco standard faces, which the V1 does not have. It does feature the classic Schneider Jokers, as all the Orbit decks do. As well, it does have the Schneider Ace of Spades, which I think is a lot better than the Ace of Spades on the original V1 Orbit deck. And I do love the way that this deck handles. I mean, in general, this is, all the Orbit decks are printed on crushed premium stock, but this deck feels very, very nice and soft and malleable, whereas the first one feels a little bit more clumpy, so this deck was definitely a success in terms of handling as well. So, let's talk about what's coming in my number 7 spot. Number 7, Orbit V7 Parallel Edition. This one was kind of a mixed bag in terms of how it was received by everybody. Luckily, this was not the actual V7 deck. This was a additional version of the V7 deck. This deck definitely makes for some nice fans. It definitely looks good in spreads. I do love the 1990s or late 80s, early 90s kind of color scheme. I love that it actually says Orbit on the back. I think that's a really nice touch as well. Also, I do like the navy and purple pips and indices for this deck. I think that red would have clashed with it too much, so I like that that was done. I also like the new Parallel Universe spin that was put on the Ace of Spades and the Jokers for this deck, which wouldn't make a lot of sense if we didn't know what the V7 design looked like. There's not a lot that I don't like about this deck. However, I will say that the reason it came in where it did on the list is just because some of the other editions of the Orbit deck I think do more for me than this deck does. It's just not something that I think holds up to some of the other decks in the Orbit catalog. So that is my number 7 in my Orbit decks. All right, so my number 6 is maybe a little bit controversial because I know that this is a favorite for a lot of you. But we're gonna talk about my reasonings for putting it as number 6 on my list right now. But first, what is it? Number 6, Orbit 5th Edition. All right, now the Orbit 5th Edition was definitely a game changer in terms of introducing or reintroducing some really bright colors, and this was also the first Orbit deck that had two-tone colors on the back. This was also the first Orbit deck that was done in a matte cardstock for the tuck box, which looks really good with this pale blue and very vibrant orange. This was a super summery looking deck. Another thing that was really popular was the broken border, which technically was done on the 4th edition deck with the white kind of streak that went through it, but this was the first one not done in white that really had a pronounced border break. And that just made fans look really, really interesting and very appealing, very attractive. As well, in terms of the actual design work, this was definitely something that we had not seen from Orbit yet. It was probably their brightest colored deck at the time. The courts were done in this kind of faded gray and red color, which looked really nice. I love the use of red and blue on the court cards. It was also the first time that we got any color on the Jokers and Ace of Spades. As all Orbit decks are, this deck was printed on crushed premium stock. It had a very, very nice and soft feel, and it's just one of those decks that you could play with over and over and over. Now, I will say also, I have purchased more of this deck than any other Orbit deck in the world. When this deck first came out, I picked up like a half brick. I blew through like 3 or 4 of them really quickly just using them. So I ran through them a lot. So I ended up buying another half brick, and then they went on sale later. And I bought more. So I have owned more than a brick of this deck, and that is definitely the most of any Orbit deck that I've owned. So there we go. That was number 5. So there you go. That is number 6. All right, now number 5 is a deck that is extremely, extremely special to me for a couple of reasons. Number 1, the first Orbit Jam that I really went nuts for, and I mean like really, really went nuts for, was for this deck. And as well, it's a deck that I think is extremely on point with what was extremely popular at the time when it came out. So number 5, the Orbit 4th Edition. Now, what can I say about this deck other than it's basically perfect from end to end? This was the first time that Orbit introduced the border break into their design, which was not extremely popular at the time. Although now it's extremely common to see decks that have border breaks. At the time when this deck came out, which I believe was 2016 or 2017, that was not something that you saw very often. This deck comes in a black and white colorway, which is really, really preferred by a lot of people. A lot of magicians out there really love the use of black ink on a playing card. It's very modern, it sells really well, and it's just something that kind of goes with everything. Also featuring the classic Orbit Jokers and Ace of Spades. This deck is a true Orbit deck from start to finish. It has everything that you would want in an Orbit deck, but when it came out, it introduced so much more. I think really, I mean, the V5 was a game changer in terms of having a two-tone colorway and some of those really nice colors on the Jokers and Ace of Spades, but this to me was the ultimate Orbit game changer. It really, I think, set the way for future designs. So if this one wasn't made, we may never have gotten some of the better Orbit decks out there. Coming in at number 4, you probably can guess what it is, but just in case you can't, it is the Orbit 7th edition. This is the regular 7th edition, not the parallel. The parallel was lower on the list. Now, this deck was impressive. With the introduction of the V7, it kind of took on a more traditional Orbit style, and by traditional, I really just mean reminiscent more of the first, second, and third Orbit decks. It has really, really thin borders. It does have a two-toned colorway, so it's nice and updated. One thing that I really, really love about this deck, and the reason why it was so high up on my list, is because this is the first marked Orbit deck. In the V7, you can see that the astronaut now has a dog with him on his bike, and that is actually a rendering of Orbit Brown's dog, Dexter. Now, a lot of you already know that, but this deck is marked. It's fully marked, value and suit, so it's perfect for performing magic, but as well, this is the first time that's been introduced on an Orbit deck. So for magicians out there, this is really all-encompassing. You get your classic kind of Orbit aesthetic with everything from the Ace of Spades to the Jokers. The thing is, there was a lot of firsts with this deck. So not only is it the first marked deck that Orbit has ever done, but also it's the first deck that they printed on a web press. I love that this deck has a lot of pink on the back design, and it has pink for the hearts and diamonds, but I really, really love this navy blue and pink aesthetic on the back. Just in general, there's really nothing to not like about this deck. It's so good. I love it so much. All right, guys, we got 3 decks left to go. Through process of elimination, you might be able to figure it out, but just in case you can't, here's what's coming in at number 3. Cardistry Con First Edition reprint. Now, just to show how much I actually did love the V1, coming in at number 3 is the V1 reprint. It kind of just addressed all of the things that somebody could find wrong with the first edition. This deck is one of only 1,000, which is not a reason why it's so high on this list, but it basically just took all the things that people loved about the first edition and updated them to modern standards. The tuck box is done in matte cardstock instead of glossy cardstock. The seal denotes that it is one of 1,000, and the borders on the back design are significantly thinner than you could find them on the V1. I also love that the Ace of Spades has been updated to the Daniel Schneider design instead of the one that we saw on the first edition. And while this deck is on the same cardstock as every Orbit deck, the cards feel extremely good and less clumpy than the V1 edition. All right, guys, there's 2 decks left on my list. So if it's not the first edition, if it's not the third edition, or the V7P, or the 5th edition, or the 4th, or the 7th, or the Cardistry Con First Edition, coming in at number 2 is Orbit 6th edition. Now, for all intents and purposes, this really should be my favorite Orbit deck because this is definitely the deck that I use the most. I've had almost as much of these as I have of the 5th edition. You guys can see from my pictures, you guys can see from my videos, this is a deck that I use for almost everything. I perform magic with this deck. I definitely practice cardistry with this deck. This is one of those decks that when it came out, I was so excited to see because the V5 was so different. Seeing the V6 come out and kind of follow in suit and continue to evolve the Orbit brand was really, really unique. This was also the only Orbit deck that doesn't feature an astronaut on the Jokers. It features an alien. The deck is done in full color. I love the customization on the court cards. I love the colors of the court cards. I love the enlarged pips on the aces. I definitely love this unique blue color on the back design, and I love the way that it contrasts with that green border break. This is one of those decks that I could just use every single day. So while they should be number 1 in terms of how much I love them, there's only one that cuts above it. And of course, by process of elimination, number 1 is the Orbit 2nd edition. I mean, what can I say? I think this is the rarest Orbit deck besides the Cardistry Con reprint, or maybe just as rare. But again, that's not what I love about it. What I love about this deck is just like the Cardistry Con reprint, it took a lot of the things that I wouldn't have liked about the V1 edition and kind of just fixed them for the 2nd edition. The borders are, in my opinion, kind of the perfect size. I love the maroon red colorway. That is my favorite color for playing cards. Not only does it feature the Daniel Schneider Jokers, but it also features the Daniel Schneider Ace of Spades, which is really a staple in Orbit decks. It's probably something that we're going to see a variation of for every Orbit deck to come. As well, I love the handling of this deck. I love how long it lasts. As you can see, no matter how yellow or broken in the cards get, they still handle just as good as any of the Orbit decks. And they have completely standard faces, which makes this deck perfect for Magic Performance. I mean, just in general, there's nothing about this deck that I don't like. The only thing that would have put this deck behind the Orbit V6 is the handling, but this deck handles better than the V6 did, so that's why it's number one. This is a deck that if I'm on my way out and I don't know what deck I'm going to grab either to perform or if I'm just going somewhere and I want to bring some cards with me, if I don't know what to grab, I usually will just grab this. It's a deck that just lasts forever. It feels really, really good still, and I love the way that it looks. So it captures, to me, everything that a deck should be, which has a beautiful design, faces that are easy to understand and easy to interpret. It feels really good. It just covers all the bases. The only thing that I didn't like about this deck is that it was so limited that really it was difficult to get more than one if you didn't get them when they first came out. And of course, we're going to give an honorable mention to the Forest playing cards. I do really love this deck, and I heard a rumor that there's going to be a Forest V2, and if there is, I definitely plan on purchasing it, but I just couldn't put it in the lineup because it's not really an Orbit deck. It's a deck made by Orbit, but really, really like this deck either way. I don't even know where this would go if it did go into the list somewhere. All right, so that was it. So just a quick recap. I'm gonna put the ranking that I have of the Orbit decks here. Although I genuinely do love everything that Orbit has done so far. I love Orbit's merch, as you can see. I love that the Forest deck was for a good charity to plant a tree. In my opinion, Orbit is just one of those companies that has the lasting power that it's gonna take to really stay ahead of the game. And not to mention the forward thinking of Orbit Brown and his team and the endless talent of Daniel Schneider. Those guys are gonna be just fine. So, no matter what ranking we have, I guess at the end of the day, it's just a great company. So there you go. However, I do want to hear from you guys. So why don't you let me know in the comments what your ranking of the Orbit decks are. Even if you don't own all of them, just put them down there, just based on design or whatever. They're all printed on the same card stock. So why don't you leave me your ranking of the Orbit decks down below. I'm so interested to read them. I got some really cool videos planned, guys. I got a few big ones coming up. I got a few smaller ones coming up. All exciting stuff. So I hope that you will subscribe if you haven't already so you can see all that stuff. And if you're feeling really generous, please do drop a like on the video. It does help me out quite a bit. With all that being said, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day. I know I will. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.